As we sit here tonight, a month out from Christmas, it appears less and less likely that Albanese will win the next election. I say this not based on the polls, although the polls are sharply tracking downward, but based on the climate in Australia right now. Labor say, oh, but Peter Dutton, he's unelectable. But he's not looking so unelectable right now. Albanese also claims he is reassured by the fact that it's been nearly 100 years since Labor had a one-term government. In fact, it was the Great Depression in 1931 that saw Labor booted after one term. But traditions are currently being shattered. In America, there'd been only one president who'd won 2 non-consecutive terms. That was Grover Cleveland in the late 1800s. Well, Trump smashed that tradition. He was only the second president in US history, and we saw his win was a landslide, 312 college votes compared with Kamala's 226. So Albanese can't feel comforted by precedent and predictable voting patterns when they're being obliterated. Now, what makes Australian voters consider voting Albanese out is just how he's dramatically reshaped our country without warning or even getting a mandate for it at the last election. And his list of broken promises is mounting. Now, as you know, Albanese took a small target agenda to the 2022 election. He sold voters on a dream of cheaper cost of living, lower power bills and petrol prices. This is the Prime Minister's greatest failure. Simon Benson reports, and I quote, that households are suffering the worst decline in living standards since the 1950s, with the fall in real disposable income eclipsing those of the last 4 major recessions, including the 1970s inflation crisis and the COVID pandemic. Benson also reports that the current cost of living crisis is hurting households twice as hard as during the 1990 and 82 recession. And it's not pretty when you look at how other OECD countries are faring. Here's Australia's real gross household disposable income per capita. That's the figure that you can see in red. It's now falling. And compared to the OECD, which is the line in blue, that's now rising. That's each household's disposable income. Now, at the same time as this graph shows, we're paying more personal income tax than ever, and it's forecast to skyrocket further. You can see that forecast, the red dotted line. Again, the worst living standards since the 1950s are now occurring under a Prime Minister who was literally elected on a cost of living platform. Remember how often Albanese rammed that message home during the election campaign?
We've said that our priority is cost of living, putting that downward pressure on inflation whilst making sure that we provide support for families and for people with cost of living pressures. Take pressure off cost of living, pressure off the cost of living, the cost of living, cost of living.
Now, the cost of living crisis would be reason enough for voters to question voting Albanese back in, but there's so much more. The competition is tough for Albanese's worst move since becoming PM. And here's some of the worst, and let's call them Albo-atrocities. There's the misinformation legislation, the radical environmental laws, the big Australia immigration policy that made the housing crisis worse. Just last week, the political raid on the Future Fund, the voice failure and the division that came with it. His tolerance for racism against Jews, his doubling the tax on superannuation for wealthy retirees. And who could forget releasing criminals onto the streets where they've been free to bash grannies. The list is much longer than this, of course. Albanese has also refused to sign up to the COP29 nuclear agreement alongside all like-minded countries around the world. And then there's the unfathomable decision to grant visas to Palestinians from a terrorist-controlled war zone while refusing a visa for a distinguished former Israeli minister who has family here in Australia. And the Palestinians are here to stay, thousands of them, while the Israeli minister was only meant to come here to speak at a security conference and visit her family. Albanese and his sidekick Penny Wong also treat allies as enemies and enemies as allies, cozying up to China while continually attacking our ally in Israel. Even the Biden administration is perplexed. The moral confusion that we're seeing is astonishing. The capitulation to terrorism, inexplicable. Now, Christopher Dahl breaks all of this down in his column, easily the most readable in the country, and he writes, Australia has changed under Anthony Albanese. It is more hateful, it is less safe. Its families are poorer, its place in the world less clear. Its collective values corroded, its common sense corrupted. We are less united, less happy, and fundamentally more divided. A change of government has changed our country. It has been slow and subtle. It is now surreal. And his column's on the cover of the Nightly, which says, "The rebrand of Australia gone wrong." And he's spot on. We're all worse off, economically and socially. Albanese's fingerprints on almost every facet of our lives is now in upheaval. Without warning or asking for a mandate, Albanese embarked on dramatic and dangerous change to our country.